Today we're diving into something that hits pretty close to home for a lot of people, tariffs.
Oh, yeah.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at how they could impact the U.S. housing market. We got some interesting sources lined up, a Bankrate article, a blog post from Bigger Pockets, and even a report from J.P. Morgan.
Wow, that's quite the spread of information.
Yeah, and they all seem to be pointing to a pretty strong connection between global trade policies and, well, the price of that dream house.
I think it's fascinating. We often think of tariffs as these abstract economic policies, like
Yeah.
something that only economists really understand.
Yeah.
But this deep dive, I think, it really reveals just how much they can actually impact our everyday lives.
Totally. Okay, so let's break it down.
Yeah.
We know the Trump administration has been shaking things up with tariffs,
Right.
but how does that actually connect to the housing market? Like, what's the link?
Well, I think the key is to think about all the materials that go into building a house.
Right.
Your lumber, steel, even things like drywall. A pretty big chunk of these materials are actually imported.
Okay.
And when tariffs come into play, those import costs, well, they shoot up.
And those increased costs, I mean, they don't just disappear, right? They get
No.
passed down to, well, whoever's buying that house, the
Yeah.
consumer.
Right.
So we're potentially talking about higher prices for new homes, for renovations, just everything across the board.
Exactly. Yeah. And the Bankrate article actually gives this pretty clear example.
Okay.
They talk about a home builder who's importing Canadian lumber. Now, with a 25% tariff, a $200,000 shipment of lumber ends up costing an extra $50,000.
Whoa, that's a pretty big hit to their budget.
Yeah, it is. And that cost, it's going to be reflected somewhere, most likely in the final price of the house.
Hold on a second. You said Canadian lumber.
Right.
Like, how much of the lumber we use actually comes from Canada?
It's more than you'd think, actually. The Bankrate article points out that a significant amount of the lumber used in U.S. home construction is actually from Canada.
Wow, okay.
So it's a crucial part of that whole supply chain,
Right.
which makes the U.S. housing market pretty vulnerable to these kinds of tariff changes.
That makes sense. So
Right.
if tariffs make imported lumber more expensive,
Yeah.
wouldn't that make domestic lumber more competitive?
Yeah.
Like, could we potentially see more lumber production happening here in the U.S.?
That's a really good point. And it is possible,
Okay.
but it's not as simple as just flipping a switch,
Right.
Increasing domestic lumber production takes time, it takes investment, it takes resources.
Yeah.
So we really have to consider whether the U.S. can, ramp up production quickly enough to meet that demand and actually offset those rising costs.
So there are these logistical hurdles like lead times and stuff?
Exactly, yeah. And we can't forget, we're not only talking about lumber here.
Oh, right.
This whole ripple effect of tariffs extends to all kinds of building materials.
Okay, so like, give me an example.
The National Association of Home Builders, they've actually pointed out that over 70% of the gypsum that's used for drywall, in the U.S. comes from Mexico.
Wow, 70%. So if Mexico decides, hey, we're going to hit back with some tariffs of our own,
Exactly.
we could be looking at like a pretty significant increase in the cost of drywall too, right?
Right, yeah. And this is just one example, this whole potential for a chain reaction of tariffs and then counter tariffs. It could create just a ton of uncertainty and volatility in the market.
And speaking of uncertainty, let's talk about mortgage rates for a second.
Okay, yeah.
Could tariffs actually impact something as complex as interest rates?
Well, it's not a direct correlation, but there is a potential link.
Okay.
The Bigger Pockets article actually highlights this. They talk about Capital Economics. It's this research firm, and they're predicting that these tariffs could actually lead to increased inflation.
Okay, so break that down for me. How do tariffs actually translate into higher prices for, well,
And
everything?
think of it this way. If businesses are paying more for imported goods because of tariffs,
Yeah.
they're going to pass those extra costs on to us, the consumers, right?
Right.
In the form of higher prices. And when those prices go up, that's like the classic definition of inflation.
Yeah, Econ 101.
Exactly.
But I'm still not totally clear on how interest rates fit into all of this.
Okay, so the Federal Reserve, the Fed,
Yeah.
they control interest rates. And their main job is to keep prices stable and, maximize employment.
Right.
When inflation starts creeping up, the Fed usually responds by raising those interest rates.
Okay.
It's their way of trying to cool down the economy, keep those price increases in check.
So if the Fed raises interest rates to try and counter this tariff-induced inflation, that could push mortgage rates higher too.
Yeah, exactly. It's like this whole chain of events, and there's really a lot of uncertainty about how it will actually play out.
Yeah.
Even Mark Hamrick, he's a senior economic analyst at Bankrate, he's quoted as saying, questions involving tariffs and their specific impacts are really tough to answer because we know so little about the specifics.
Okay, so we're already seeing how these tariffs could affect new construction, renovations.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about potentially higher mortgage rates on top of that.
Yeah.
It's kind of a daunting picture for anyone who's, hoping to buy a house anytime soon.
Yeah, it's definitely something to pay attention to. And, the impact goes way beyond housing.
Okay.
These tariffs have the potential to really disrupt whole industries, especially those with these complex global supply chains.
Give me an example, like what other industries could be hit hard by this?
Well, let's take the automotive industry.
Okay, yeah.
The Bigger Pockets article highlights that the U.S. imported a whopping 2.5 million cars from Mexico and another 1.1 million from Canada just in 2024 alone. That's almost a quarter of all the cars sold in the U.S.
Wow, that is a ton of cars. So if tariffs get added to all those imports,
Well, it could create a pretty significant cost increase for manufacturers.
Yeah.
And also, of course, for us, the consumers.
Right.
Think about it. A car is made of thousands of parts,
Yeah.
many of them sourced from different countries. When you start tacking on tariffs to those parts, it adds up to a pretty hefty price increase for that final product.
It's like this ripple effect that goes through the whole economy.
Exactly. Yeah. Barclays, that financial services company, they estimated that these tariffs could actually wipe out the profits of some car makers if they don't make some serious adjustments.
Okay, so we've got lumber, drywall, cars, and potentially even interest rates all being affected.
And that's really just the tip of the iceberg.
Right, right.
The potential for these tariffs to really mess with global trade and trigger this chain reaction of consequences, well, it's pretty significant.
So for our listeners out there who are probably thinking, okay, this is all interesting, but what does this mean for me?
Right.
What are the key takeaways they should be considering?
Well, that's a great question. It really depends on your individual circumstances and your investment strategy.
Okay, so let's say for someone who's a buy and hold real estate investor,
Okay.
what should they be thinking about?
Well, they might need to factor in those potentially higher prices for appliances and electronics.
Oh, right.
A lot of those are manufactured in China,
Yeah.
which is, another major target of these tariffs.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about someone who's more into construction or flipping houses?
Well, they should probably brace themselves for those potential increases in the cost of materials. Like lumber, steel, and drywall.
Right, yeah.
Those price increases could really cut into their profit margins.
Yeah, I see that. So, big picture, for everyone in general, what's the main thing to watch out for?
I'd say keep a close eye on construction volume.
Yeah.
If these higher material costs lead to a slowdown in construction,
Right.
that could have some pretty long-term effects on the housing market as a whole.
All right, so lots to consider. But, let's say these tariffs do actually push those housing costs higher.
Right.
Is there anything the government could do to try and offset that?
Well, the Bankrate article talks about a few potential actions the government could take to try to make housing more affordable.
Like what? What are some of the options?
Well, one option is to invest more in building and renovating affordable housing units.
Okay, so increase the supply.
Exactly, yeah. If you increase supply to meet that potential increase in demand,
Right.
well, it could help keep prices in check.
Makes sense. Anything else?
Another option is to offer some tax incentives or subsidies to home buyers,
Right.
particularly first-time buyers or low-income families.
Right.
Those incentives could help make homeownership more attainable even with those rising costs.
Okay, that makes sense. Any other ideas they mentioned?
Well, there's also the deregulation route. Okay. The Trump administration already signed this executive order aimed at reducing housing costs by cutting back on regulations.
So the idea is that less red tape could mean lower construction costs.
Yeah, in theory. But it's important to note that some of those regulations they're targeting are environmental regulations, from the EPA.
Okay.
So there could be some environmental trade-offs to think about. It's not as simple as just saying deregulation is good.
Right, right. So there are some potential solutions, but each one comes with its own set of complexities.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And ultimately, we don't have a crystal ball. We just don't know what the future holds for these tariffs and what their impact will be on the housing market.
Right, so a lot of uncertainty right now. But for our listeners who are feeling a little bit overwhelmed by all of this,
Yeah.
what's the best way to kind of navigate these uncertain times? Like, what can they do right now?
Well, the Bankrate article actually offers some pretty solid advice.
Okay, lay it on us.
First, shop around for the best mortgage rates. Don't just settle for the first offer you get. With rates potentially going up, it's more important than ever to compare and find the most favorable terms.
Good point. What else?
Focus on improving your credit score.
Right.
A higher score usually means lower interest rates, which can save you a ton of money over the life of your mortgage.
Right. Right.
And lastly, be open to considering maybe different locations or types of housing. You know, if your dream home is suddenly out of reach because those costs are rising, you might need to adjust your expectations.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe look at a different location or consider a condo or townhouse instead of that single-family home.
Solid advice. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here in part one of our deep dives.
We have.
We've explored how tariffs can impact the price of those building materials, the whole chain reaction of counter tariffs, the link between tariffs and those interest rates,
Yeah.
and how all of this is spilling over into other industries like the automotive industry.
It's been quite a journey.
It has.
And we've seen that, well, even though there's a lot of uncertainty, understanding these potential impacts can really help you make those more informed decisions about housing and investments.
Absolutely. And this is just the beginning. In part two, we're going to delve even deeper into the potential long-term consequences of these tariffs.
Right.
We'll explore the possibility of manufacturing jobs returning to the U.S. and what that could actually mean for housing affordability down the road.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting discussion.
It is. We'll be right back after a quick break.
Looking forward to it.
Welcome back. We're picking up our exploration of tariffs and, well, how they could reshape the whole U.S. housing market.
Yeah, we left off talking about how those ripple effects could impact a whole bunch of industries.
Right, and what it all means for, for our listeners.
Exactly.
It's not just about, the price of lumber going up, right? There are these, bigger economic forces at play.
Oh, absolutely.
That could really, reshape the whole housing landscape.
Yeah.
One of the things we haven't really dug into yet is this whole idea of tariffs potentially leading to a resurgence in U.S. manufacturing.
Right, right.
So instead of importing so many goods from other countries, we might see more companies bringing those jobs back to the U.S. That sounds like, on the surface, a good thing, right?
Yeah, it definitely has the potential to be.
Okay.
But it's not quite as simple as just saying, more jobs equals a better housing market.
Yeah, right.
There are some nuances there.
Okay. Help me understand the nuances then. How could more manufacturing jobs actually, make the housing situation more complicated?
Well, imagine, a bunch of manufacturing jobs come back to the U.S.
Okay.
That creates this new demand for housing in the areas where those factories are, right?
So more people competing for homes.
Exactly.
Which could push those prices up even higher.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm starting to see the potential downside here.
Right. And, if the wages for those new manufacturing jobs don't actually keep pace with those rising housing costs,
Right.
it could create this situation where housing becomes less affordable for a lot of people, even the ones who have those jobs.
So it's not just about creating jobs, it's about making sure those jobs, pay enough.
Yeah.
That people can actually afford to live, where the jobs are.
Exactly. It requires a more comprehensive approach.
Right.
We have to look beyond just the raw numbers of jobs created.
Right.
And consider things like wage growth, the housing supply, those overall economic conditions.
That makes sense. So while the return of manufacturing jobs could be a good thing, we have to be mindful of those unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to, housing affordability.
Absolutely. It really highlights the need to look at the whole picture, the economic and the social impacts of these policies.
Speaking of addressing the issue, earlier we talked about those potential government actions to try and offset rising housing costs.
Right.
One idea was, giving tax breaks or subsidies to home buyers. Could that actually work?
Well, the Bankrate article does mention that as a possible strategy.
Yeah.
And, it's been tried before
Okay.
with, mixed results.
What are some of the potential downsides to that approach?
Well, one concern is that if you just give people more money to buy homes,
Yeah.
but you don't actually address that underlying supply issue,
Right.
you could actually make the problem worse.
Okay.
If you increase demand without increasing supply,
Yeah.
prices are probably just going to go up even higher.
So it's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Right,
You're
exactly.
just adding fuel to the fire.
It shows how important it is to tackle both sides of the problem,
Okay.
demand and supply.
So what's the solution then? How do you actually increase that supply of affordable housing, especially in areas where there's a ton of demand?
That's the big question, isn't it? There's no easy answer.
Right.
It's going to require a multi-pronged
That,
approach. Things like zoning reform, making it easier to get permits, incentivizing developers to actually build more affordable units.
so it's not just about throwing money at the problem.
Right.
It's about, creating a system that encourages that development.
Exactly. Yeah. It needs to be a collaborative effort,
Okay.
between policymakers, developers, and, the community as a whole.
Right.
And it's a long game, not a quick fix.
Okay, so it sounds like we need like a real shift in thinking,
Yeah.
commitment to, to long-term planning.
Absolutely. It's about moving away from those Band-Aid solutions
Right.
and really embracing a more sustainable approach to how we build housing.
It's a tough issue, but it sounds like we got to start thinking about those long-term solutions now.
I agree.
We can't wait till it's, too late.
Definitely not. And, while we're thinking about those solutions, it's important to remember that we're still dealing with a lot of unknowns when it comes to these tariffs.
Right, right.
Things are changing all the time.
Yeah.
We need to be ready for some unexpected twists and turns.
Speaking of unexpected twists and turns, we've been focusing on those potential downsides,
Yeah.
but are there any, potential upsides that we've missed?
That's a good point.
It's easy to get caught up in the, the doom and gloom.
Right.
But is there like another side to this coin?
That's a really great question.
Yeah.
It's always good to look at both sides
Right.
and challenge your own assumptions.
So could there actually be some unexpected benefits to these tariffs?
Yeah, there could be.
In the first two parts, we really got into it with these tariffs and how they could impact the U.S. housing market.
Yeah.
And I got to say, a lot of it has been, well, kind of, gloomy, kind of not the best news.
Yeah.
But as promised, we're going to switch gears a little bit in this final part, and we're going to explore some of the potential benefits
Okay.
that might actually come out of these trade tensions.
Right. It's important to remember that even in these complex situations,
Mm-hmm.
there can be some surprising positive outcomes.
Okay, I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
So what are some of the potential upsides? Like what good news could we actually see?
Well, one possibility is that these tariffs could actually lead to more stuff being made here in the U.S.
Okay, so you're saying instead of relying on imports, American companies might start producing more goods right here at home.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And that could have a bunch of positive effects.
Okay.
First, it could create jobs
Okay.
and boost the economy.
Right.
And second, it could lead to some cool new technologies and processes,
Right.
as companies are trying to become more competitive in the global marketplace.
But wouldn't those domestically produced goods be more expensive, at least at first, than the imported ones that we're all used to?
Yeah, you're right. At first, they probably would be. There might be an adjustment period where prices are a little higher. But as domestic production increases and we get those economies of scale kicking in, prices could actually come down.
Okay, so like short-term pain,
Yeah.
long-term gain kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And it's not just about lower prices either,
Okay.
Increased domestic production, it could also lead to higher quality goods
Right.
and a more resilient supply chain.
Resilient meaning.
Meaning less vulnerable to disruptions.
Okay.
So if we're not so reliant on imports,
Yeah.
we're less likely to be affected by things like, trade wars,
Right.
natural disasters,
Yeah.
or, just all that geopolitical instability that's happening in other parts of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah,
So like a more stable system, basically.
exactly.
Okay, cool.
Now, another potential benefit is we might see more investment in automation and technology.
Ooh, automation. Okay, so are we like talking robots taking over here?
Yeah.
Should I be scared?
No, not necessarily. Think of it this way. If labor costs are a bit higher because of these tariffs,
Okay.
companies might be more likely to invest in automation,
Okay.
to become more efficient and rely less on human labor.
Okay, so that means, there might be fewer jobs in some areas, but it could also create opportunities in those fields, all that automation and technology stuff.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And those new jobs, they're likely to be higher paying,
Right.
and they require more specialized skills.
So a shift in the job market, basically.
Yeah,
But ultimately, it could mean a more skilled workforce and people making more money.
precisely.
Okay.
And this goes back to what we were talking about before with those manufacturing jobs coming back.
Yeah.
It's not just about how many jobs there are.
Right.
It's about, the quality of those jobs.
So even if we don't see like a huge wave of manufacturing jobs coming back to the U.S.,
Right.
the ones that do come back, well, they could be, more innovative, more high tech,
Yeah.
and ultimately better for the overall economy.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah. And that kind of economic growth, well, it could have this positive ripple effect, throughout society
yeah.
and potentially even benefit the housing market in the long run.
Okay, so as always, it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
All these different factors, but
Yeah.
it sounds like there is potential for some good to come out of this,
Right.
even with all this uncertainty.
Absolutely. And I think it's great that we're acknowledging those potential benefit,
Yeah.
while still keeping in mind those risks and challenges that we talked about.
Right. Right.
It's all about finding that balance,
Yeah. Yeah. I like that
Uh,
that nuanced perspective.
well said. Well said.
Thanks.
As we wrap up this, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
We've been talking about how these tariffs could impact all these different industries and the whole economy.
Yeah.
But what about us as individuals?
Right.
How could these policies affect your personal finances? Yeah.
Your career choices,
Right.
or even just your lifestyle.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that, these global shifts, they have very real impacts on all of us.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to encourage everyone listening, take what you've learned in this deep dive
Yeah.
and think about how it applies to your own life.
Absolutely.
Think about how it could affect, your job, your investments, even just your spending habits.
It's been a fascinating exploration.
It has.
And I hope everyone listening feels a little bit more informed
Yeah.
and empowered to navigate these uncertain times.
Me too. Me too. And remember, this is not static.
Yeah.
Things are constantly changing and evolving. So stay curious, stay informed, and as always, keep diving deeper.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.